Hello and welcome to ICA in Conversation that broadcasts on the second and fourth Wednesdays of each month, focusing on current issues and challenges in the context of compliance and counter-financial crime. I'm Tim Tyler, and coming up we're going to consider how we understand, define and promote compliance. This comes at the end of a series of webinars that considered compliance as an enabler. You may have joined us when I spoke to, first Valerie Nielsen, then Andrea Bonime-Blanc, and finally Gaon Hart, who each brought their own views and experience on this important topic. This, the final webinar, will be a little different. There's no guest. I'm on my own with you today. So the conversation is simply between you and I. And I hope it gives us an opportunity to pause, reflect on key learning and outcomes from those webinars and from wider thought that I've been giving to the issues around compliance over the last few months. As ever, I'd love to hear from you. Any questions, challenges, observations that you may have. These can be made using the comments on the LinkedIn Live event. I've got a feed next to me. It's lovely to see everyone joining from around different parts of the world. But this, of course, is also an opportunity for you to make those observations that you may have. My goal over the next 30 minutes is to set out 8 key areas of good practice that are relevant to our role in compliance and came out of those 3 webinars with Valerie, Andrea, and Gaon. I also will set out a hierarchical model that could be useful to you in positioning and promoting compliance within your own business. First, though, can I set the scene, the context? I think it's fair to say that we face unprecedented challenges in compliance at the moment. I don't know whether you'd agree with that. Perhaps we can just pause for a moment and reflect on what those challenges are. Geopolitically, where we see conflict, nationalism, climate change, a change in the balance of power that affects businesses, those businesses that we serve and their supply chains, their ownership, their agendas even in some instances. A second area which is unprecedented, is around legal and regulatory, where we're moving towards a multipolar position. A number of different power bodies, organizations, influencing the way in which we meet legal and regulatory requirements. The US changing its stance in some instances, a divergence between it and much of the rest of the world in some areas, at least at the moment. A sustained regulatory expansion in the EU, in the teeth of government commitments to reduce regulatory burdens. And of course, as we face economic headwinds. And in the context of technology, where we're seeing a convergence of unimaginably powerful technologies like artificial intelligence, blockchain, biometrics, and quantum computing, which will change the way in which we process information beyond our imagination. And for those of us working in countering financial crime, a fourth area of change, of course, is within the criminal community. Our adversaries, who are growing in reach, sophistication, and audacity. Each of these 4 areas has been described as volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Now, you might say that this, of course, impacts on many areas of business, and it does. But compliance, by its nature, is fundamentally affected by all of these. And it can potentially be on the front line of our response to them and the business response to them. So much then for context. This you'll already appreciate. Can we focus on compliance itself for a moment? You'll know, of course, that compliance has evolved over the last 20, 30 years from small, often highly technical teams, often just grudgingly accepted as a necessary evil by the businesses they worked within. Business that was, of course, highly focused on profit, less so on compliance. Now things have changed. Those teams are very often large, affecting every area of business. Our role has changed. And this is something that I'll come back to in the next few minutes. It's often the case that businesses continue, however, to see us with grudging acceptance. We still see and hear terms like Business Prevention Unit or the Fun Police, as I discussed with Gaon in the most recent of the webinars in this series. I was talking to a colleague last week who described her engagement with the business in terms of, oh no, it's compliance, a sort of fear that so often resonates across business when compliance features in their field of view or their experience or their engagement with other parts of the business. So there is something about our narrative, the way in which we relate to business. But we can also say that compliance is expensive. And that also has grown in the last decades, measured now in the hundreds of billions of dollars or pounds or euros. And this in the face of economic headwinds, politicians and CEOs that are looking to reduce costs, to cut back. Some have suggested that there is a perception amongst some that, well, there could be a triple benefit in cutting back on compliance. Firstly, it reduces the costs, the compliance costs. Secondly, it can reduce operational overheads, freeing up business to concentrate on profit. And thirdly, reducing what is seen as unpopular in some parts, the fun police. That's a perception that is often encountered within business. Not all the time, but often. So it was with all this in mind that about 8 or 9 months ago, I started to zero in on the nature and role of compliance. I wanted to better understand it in a way that is coherent. So I started to see that different roles, of course, undertaken within different businesses, different business size, different sectors and jurisdictions, well, they generated different compliance requirements. And it was that I struggled to organise into a coherent narrative. And of course, the role of compliance will vary between different sectors and jurisdictions and businesses. But how can we characterise our role within compliance in a way that makes sense to us and that helps us to effectively lead and manage the capabilities within compliance to move between them, perhaps, between different organisations, and vitally enables us to define and defend our position to a CEO or perhaps a politician looking to realise savings. So the discussions with Valerie and Andrea and Gaon were useful in crystallising these issues. I'll come on to talk about the areas of good practice that we identified, but a more fundamental level. They've helped, I think, to define compliance in a way that can apply across businesses, regardless of sector, size, or jurisdiction. So that was my ambition. And I've distilled this into a PowerPoint, a single PowerPoint slide, a model, a hierarchical model that I hope will be useful. So I'm going to share that with you now. This model, which my colleague is just pulling up at the moment, defines a compliance hierarchy, and it starts with a foundation. Foundational level compliance, which at its heart is about protecting businesses. That will always be present in compliance activity. By its very nature, by its definition, it involves compliance. Whether that's with legal or regulatory compliant requirements. In financial services, they can look very different to, for instance, compliance within health, within pharmaceuticals, within oil and gas. But there is that requirement for businesses to simply be compliant. That is where we started 20, 30 years or more ago. And that will always be at the heart of compliance activity. And it could be that there is little more than this that you're engaged with, and that's fine. But we can move to a second layer within our compliance hierarchy, where there's opportunity for compliance businesses to enable the businesses that they serve, for compliance functions to enable the business they serve. This can entail a range of activity. Of course, it recognizes 3 lines of defense, which is fundamental to our role in protecting business, but it goes way beyond that. It is about enabling business to operate with efficiency, with good governance, managing risk effectively, ensuring resilience and succession planning. This second layer of compliance activity isn't always present. We often see that compliance will focus simply at that foundational level, but there is opportunity to move up this pyramid and to see ourselves as that business enabler. And that, I think, came across very clearly in the conversations with Valerie, with Andrea, and with Gaon. But something else that came across very clearly is the opportunity we have to partner the business. This is a different mindset. This is the mindset which is less about reacting to events, about simply overlaying requirements with a compliance perspective, overlaying the potential business development, a new product, a new market with the particular legal and regulatory context in a perhaps quite reactive way. When we partner the business, then we are sharing those business goals and we're looking constantly for solutions, for ways to resolve, to enable, to drive good business. This is about finding ways to say yes, rather than, as is so often the perception, finding ways to say no. So that's a model which, of course, will work in any organization because it is a hierarchy. It would be interesting to reflect on where you see yourself in your organization, in this hierarchy. And I think part of the value in defining the model is that it allows us to reflect on, well, what's the business expectation of us? Is it simply to protect, nothing else? Maybe there's an opportunity to move up this hierarchy. Or there perhaps is an expectation that you will enable good business in the ways that are defined here. of course that raises the question of whether you're resourced to do that, whether your narrative, your internal communication matches that, whether your skills match that. So it may be that you are simply on the bottom of this hierarchy, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And if that's what the business expectation is, if that's what you're resourced to do, then that's fine. There may be no need to change that. But there is that opportunity, as particularly we're coming under pressure, the pressure that's driven by economic headwinds and the challenges presented by all those geopolitical, legal and regulatory and technological changes. We've got the opportunity to move up this hierarchy, to add value to the businesses that we serve, but to do this in a measured way. I'm going to move on from a moment from this. But before I do, it's worth just highlighting that, of course, as compliance matures, very often it moves up this hierarchy in terms of the role that it has within businesses. But equally, and maybe this is just a fact of life at the moment, maybe this is something that we need to push back on, but equally, as the resource reduces, there may be a need for us to entrench a little, to reduce our commitment to the business and move down into protect, whilst recognizing that we can do so much more. If the narrative is right, if our relationship is right, and if our resourcing is right. So that's something that may or may not be useful to you in, I hope, summarizing a single view of compliance that is coherent. I'm going to turn to the questions and comments that have been made, if I may. Thank you very much, first of all, for the observations that you've made. Fleming, you've asked about the idea that compliance function is a domain reserved for candidates with a legal background where other professions don't belong. That's an interesting observation. And it may be that there'll be cultural and organisational expectations around this. And I would be interested in what other people think. I think what we can say, though, is that over the last decade or so, compliance has grown into a profession of its own standing. It's possible now to have a career from beginning to end within compliance. There are compliance qualifications that go to undergraduate, postgraduate, diploma, and similar levels. And people have organised their careers increasingly around this. Now, whether you see that as defining a profession, of course, will be around your own cultural expectations of that particular term. But that's certainly something that we increasingly see. Having said that, coming to your question, I'm not sure if it's Fleming or Clausen, perhaps it's Clausen, but coming to your question, there can be value for some roles within compliance to have a legal background. Similarly, it could be useful to have, well, if you're in pharmaceuticals, maybe a background in other more science-related subjects. So it, of course, depends on the role. But it's an interesting question. Thank you. Shinu, thank you. You've reflected that compliance in the United Arab Emirates faces several challenges, including frequent regulatory challenges, low awareness, a shortage of skilled professionals, difficulties in defining beneficial ownership, and so the list continues. And I think it's really helpful that you've made that kind of an observation. Thank you. Because for me, it suggests that you, within compliance, need to be really clear about what it is that you do. If these are all functions and challenges that you face, then that needs to be clearly defined and understood. The resourcing that you have needs to be matched to that. Your relationship with the business needs to complement that so that you can realize those particular challenges and expectations within the business. But yes, the sorts of challenges, Sheena, you describe are common to many compliance functions around the world. So, Rebecca, it's interesting. You've commented to Klausen's earlier comment around, yes, we're moving more into a compliance profession. And that, of course, aligns quite closely with what I was saying. Maria, you've suggested that compliance could be described as the antivirus to protect your business from, of course, the virus of poor governance or weak management of risk or legal or regulatory failure. Ros, my colleague within the ICA, thank you for joining us. For the highest level of effectiveness of compliance function, I would start at the top partner. Enable and so ensure protection. So you would invert the hierarchy and start with enable in order to ensure that the organisation is protected. And of course, that's picked up in the 3 lines of defence. So yeah, I can see a logic there. I've got just a few minutes remaining, though. What I would like to do is use, and my apologies to those questions that I haven't been able to get to, but thank you nonetheless for raising them. Can I use the last few minutes to highlight 8 of the good practices that were identified within those 3 webinars that I mentioned before with Valerie, with Andrea, and with Gaon? And this overlaps to some extent with the model that I've just shared, and they to some extent also overlap with each other. But the first that we saw in terms of good practice is around mindset. And here we see mindset needing to move from reactive to proactive, to the proactive looking to understand the business, the supply chains, the operating model, and to understand what the horizon looks like in terms of the compliance agenda and requirements, the legal and regulatory changes that we can anticipate, and start to anticipate how we can support the business in meeting both of those challenges. So this is a mindset change from reactive to proactive, to problem solving rather than creating challenges and barriers. Second area of good practice that was picked up across each of those 3 webinars was around leadership and collaboration. There is a leadership function within compliance, perhaps not in a structural, formal way, but an opportunity to lead the business in terms of, well, of course, legal and regulatory requirements, but more than that, in terms of good governance, effective risk management, effective succession planning, resilience, and so on. And to do that effectively, we need, of course, to adopt a collaborative approach with the businesses that we serve. That fits with the proactive mindset, so that we work alongside. Where possible, we partner our businesses. A third area of good practice is around the language that we use and the way in which we communicate. Maybe this is quite tactical, but if we can use language that reflects business language, it demonstrates that we're aligning ourselves to the business, and it helps us to be effective in our communication with it. So Valerie, for instance, highlighted the importance of revenue growth, cost containment, and brand protection. These are sorts of things, of course, that the business will absolutely recognize and engage with. The next area, I think we're up to 4, the 4th area of good practice that came out from those webinars was around risk, and in particular, our attitude towards risk. I think there's a danger that we see risk as something to be embraced, but as a problem, as a challenge, as a difficulty. And this comes back to our mindset. Perhaps a stronger mindset is to see risk in terms of the opportunity it presents. Rather than running away from risk, as compliance professionals, we should be running towards it. That should be our mindset and approach. That's not to suggest a reckless disregard for good practice and effective management of risk, but it's to recognize that we are, and our role is, about finding solutions, answers, rather than putting obstacles in the way. There may be occasions when we have to do that, but our default, our mindset should be one of embracing risk and seeing it as an opportunity. A fifth area of good practice that came out of those webinars was around building organizational resilience. That's something that Andrea focused on in particular. The role of compliance in, for instance, embracing new technology or new products or new markets. Here we can facilitate organizational growth, but do that in a way that offers resilience because the governance is right, because the risk management is effective, because the way in which we organize change factors in the compliance requirements rather than simply bolting them on at a subsequent time. And that links to the seventh, I think we're up to 7. The 7th area of good practice, which is around seeing compliance as a business partner. This is something that we've talked about already. Rather than simply setting rules, boundaries, that compliance can be part of the conversation in growing business, markets, products, services, and the like. And sharing the goals of business, ensuring, though, that the way in which the business changes and adapts and evolves is also compliant with all those things that we have within our role. The protect element here, well, of course, is fundamental to our role. We should never lose sight of our role in protecting the business from legal and regulatory challenge, reputation challenge. But we can do that in a way which is aligned to and supportive of business objectives, so we become part of the conversation rather than an add-on. And then finally at number 8, and this I think is something that I feel is so important. It came out of, I think, all of the webinars, particularly the final webinar with Gaon. And that is the importance of developing a compelling and clear narrative around what we are within compliance and what we do, to counter the fun police, business protection unit narrative. To counter that, then we need to have our own story, our own narrative. That will vary perhaps from one organization, one sector, to the next. But we should be clear in it. We should be defined in it. And whenever we have the opportunity, we need to stand on that. It might not be a simple logo or something that trips off the tongue. It might need a little more explanation, but we need to have consistency around how we add value as well as how we protect the businesses that we serve. And I think that's a good place to finish this description of good practice, is to recognize that we serve our businesses. So often when I talk to compliance professionals, I get a sense of, well, words like we need to educate the business, we need to tell them what to do, which to some extent I think is right, but it maybe suggests a mindset that's not quite right. If we have a mindset which is serving the business that pays our wages, as well as, of course, for many of us, managing a relationship with a regulator, then that, I think, puts us in the right place, and the business will respond more effectively to it. So there's lots that has been said in the comments. Thank you very much for engaging in this way. I can see some really interesting observations that I haven't had the opportunity or time to reflect upon, but I hope that we've all been able to see them as they've been raised. So sincerely thank you for contributing to this discussion in the way that you have. I will spend a little bit longer digesting this after the event, but our half an hour is up, and that's my contract with you. I'll always stick at half an hour for these conversations. We will meet again in 2 weeks' time. It might be a colleague that's standing in for that conversation, but we will meet again, and we will continue to meet on the 2nd and 4th Wednesdays of each month. But for the moment, as I draw this to a close, can I thank you for joining me, for allowing me to share all of the last 4 webinars that have focused on compliance, and allowing me to share a little of how we might organise our thinking around this. Thank you, and do take care. Bye-bye.